let's take up the argument right here at 77C. I don't know if this is really the third part of the dialogue. I would say we're still in the second part, the extended second part of the dialogue, but that seems a good place to pick up. If we just for a moment reflect on what Socrates has tried to prove in his last argument about recollection, knowledge is recollection, Siebes has a characterization of that. He says, very true, Simmias, said Siebes, that our psyche, our soul, existed before we were born was the first half of the argument. And this appears to have been proven. That is, if the argument about knowledge as recollection is true, then it would seem to implicate an existence of the soul before birth. So then he says that the psyche will exist after death as well as before birth is the other half of which the proof is still wanting and has to be supplied. So he acknowledges that if you accept the knowledge as recollection argument, you accept that the soul existed before it was attached to the body. But that's not the same thing as saying that it will continue to exist after its separation from the body, which is what we call death, says Socrates. Socrates thinks that it's already been proven with his other arguments, but he's willing to go along with Siebes, as he well should, right? Because, okay, he's provided some reasons, perhaps, to think that the soul can exist independently of the body, but he hasn't really proved it in any kind of definitive sense. So he goes on. And right here below 78B, he continues with a different sort of argument. He says here, must we not, said Socrates, ask ourselves some question of this sort? What is it that which, as we imagine, is liable to be scattered away, about which we fear? I guess this is a reference to the notion that the soul dissipates or scatters away when it separates from the body. And what again is that about which we have no fear? And then we may proceed to inquire whether that which suffers dispersion is or is not of the nature of psyche, of soul. Our hopes and fears as to our own psyche will turn upon that. Our own souls will turn upon that. So what is he going to do here? He's going to say, well, what is the nature of the soul? And is it the kind of thing that can die, basically? That is it the kind of thing that will suffer dispersion, will break apart or break down or degrade or something like that? If it's the kind of thing that will, then our fears about death are justified. But if it's not that sort of thing, then our fears are mistaken. So basically, he's asking a question, a very interesting question. What kind of thing is the soul, so-called, the psyche? And he says this, now the compound or composite may be supposed to be naturally capable of being dissolved in like manner as of being compounded, but that which is uncompounded, and that only, must be, if anything, is indissoluble. So you can see what his strategy is here. If he can prove that the soul is not a compound thing made up of parts, but a simple thing, uncompounded, then there's reason to believe that it will not dissipate or scatter upon death. And, that becomes his strategy. Like, well, okay, what kind of thing is the soul? He begins the discussion this way, or he says that now then, this is at 78D, then now let us return to the previous discussion. Is that idea or essence, which in the dialectical process we define as essence of true existence, whether essence of equality, beauty, or anything else, are these essences, I say, liable at times to some degree of change, or are they each of them always what they are, having the same simple, self-existent, and unchanging forms, and not admitting of variation at all, or in any way, or at any time? So what is he talking about there? He's talking about concepts. He's talking about particular concepts, which he would call the forms or the eidae, the essence of equality, beauty, or anything else. these general forms, which are purely intellectual things. Let's say equality, or talk about mathematical concepts. Think about concept of number, or think of concept of a particular number, the number one, and think of that as a kind of a being or a thing, a thinkable thing. Plato would say, a thing that can be grasped only by the intellect. The concept of one, the concept of unity, or the number one. Of course, we can count particular things, particular apples, particular trees, particular squirrels. But we're talking about the abstraction, the concept of oneness. That is something Plato would say is self-existent and unchanging. Oftentimes, when I'm teaching philosophy, which I guess I am now, I say, well, think of Plato, or think of Socrates living in Athens in the 5th century BC. There was a building there called the Parthenon. It had just been built. It was a new building. And he knew this building. Now, you and I can go to Athens today, and there is a building there called the Parthenon. Is it the same building? I think the correct answer to that is yes. That is, there was a building that Socrates knew in the 5th century BC called the Parthenon, and it's still there, and you can visit it. The question is, in the meantime, over those 2,500 years, has it changed? And the answer to that is obviously yes. The Parthenon that we can visit is probably the same Parthenon that Socrates saw, but it's considerably changed. Okay, it's undergone changes in those centuries. Well, Socrates also, in the 5th century BC, he knew a theorem in geometry that if you have a right triangle and you draw squares on each one of its sides, that the area of the square that you draw on the hypotenuse is equal in area to the sum of the squares on the other two sides, the opposite and adjacent sides. Pythagorean theorem. He knew that too. And you and I know it from studying elementary geometry. When we think of the Pythagorean theorem, are we thinking of the same thing that Socrates thought of? I would say yes. Just as we can go visit the same building that he knew called the Parthenon. But then if we ask ourselves whether the Pythagorean theorem has changed, well, apparently not, right? I mean, a physical building is going to change in a certain sense in small ways. It's always changing, and over long periods of time, it changes drastically. But the kind of being that the Pythagorean theorem is a purely intellectual thing. It's a pure idea or concept, or maybe a set of concepts. And things like that don't change. They don't change like physical things because they're not in space and time, right? They are outside of space and time. And so if you think of something like that, his claim here that the essences of beauty, equality, or anything else, that these are simple, self-existent, and unchanging forms, maybe that can illustrate a little bit. That these pure ideas or forms are things that are not subject to perishing or change. So if we accept that which is really the heart of Platonism, that intellectual things, pure ideas, have an independent and different kind of existence than things that are in nature, things that are in time and space. The next step is to say, well, what is it within us that has the capacity to understand these things? And the answer to that is psyche, or soul. We might think of it as intellect. That it has the capacity to get in touch with things like the Pythagorean theorem, or the concept of one, or what Plato would call the essence or eidos of equality, beauty, the good, justice. And so it's like them. It must be like them if it can know them. That's what he says here in 79e. And to which class is the psyche, the soul, more nearly alike and akin, as far as may be inferred from this argument? as well as from the preceding one. And then I guess it's Siebes, or Simmias or Siebes says, I think, Socrates, that in the opinion of everyone who follows the argument, the psyche will be infinitely more like the unchangeable. Even the most stupid person will not deny that. And the body is more like the changing? Yes. And so he concludes, yet once more consider the matter in this light. When the psyche and the body are united, then nature orders the psyche to rule and govern, the body to obey and serve. Now, which of these two functions is akin to the divine and which is to the mortal? Does not the divine appear to you to be that which naturally orders and rules, and the mortal that which is subject and servant? So the intellect or the mind or the psyche or the soul is not only like the unchanging ideas, but it's the most divine part of us. Yeah. So, yes. And then he says, then reflect, Siebes, is not the conclusion of the whole matter this, that the psyche is in the very likeness of the divine and immortal and intelligible and uniform and indissoluble and unchangeable. That is, the psyche is the part of the human self which is divine and unchangeable. And the body is in the very likeness of the human and mortal and unintelligible and multiform and dissoluble and changeable. Can this, my dear Siebes, be denied? No, indeed. So the conclusion is that when the body and soul separate, which is how he defines death, that the body obviously decays and goes away. But the soul is a different sort of thing than the body. It's not compounded of parts. It's a simple and non-physical thing, so it basically can't die. Being the sort of conclusion of the argument. So this leads up to what is really the center of the dialogue. And that's what I guess it's Simmias who at 85C has a further objection to all this, and one more, pushing it maybe one more step, or forcing Socrates to defend his hypothesis, really, that the soul is immortal, pushing it to the limit, really. And that's really probably the most important part of the dialogue, and where we'll pick up in the next video.